of a detailed one-on-one kind of way. So Elisa, it's all yours. So glad that you're here. Take it away.
Thanks, Galen. Thank you all for being here. This is, as Galen kind of alluded to, going to be an overview of both grant writing and looking for sources of grant funding. And then I really do encourage you to take advantage of the resources that SFAI offers on an ongoing basis, the workshop tomorrow and ongoing writing tutoring, career development resources, because as we'll discuss in the next hour, you'll never come up with one perfect grant proposal that, of course, you can use in every situation. So you'll always be evolving as your practice will be evolving. The way I'm going to structure this is we'll talk about types of funding, why you might want to apply for different types of funding, and then talk about a few examples of artist statements and applications, and then I'll give you a brief writing exercise. You will not be asked to share your writing with your neighbor, so you can feel free to just write to your heart's content and keep it to yourself for now. Little bit about me. I am the SFAI grant writer. I fell into grant writing after getting an MFA in creative writing and working for several years as a journalist. I answered an ad that I thought was an ad for something else. It turned out to be a grant writer. And I've stayed with that profession because it's so necessary. And as you probably know, everybody at nonprofits ends up being a fundraiser in one way or another. The director is a fundraiser, the curators are fundraisers, the artists themselves are fundraisers. So there's always opportunity and need, and that's a very inspiring thing about this work. You also are never finished. So you're constantly evolving. Guidelines, requirements, et cetera, are constantly changing. So you're always having to keep up with what the funders are looking for. I've done grant writing mostly for arts organizations, although I've also worked for other nonprofits, the Central American Resource Center, the National Women's Law Center, and several others. And I've taught writing at NYU when I was a graduate student, and I've done writing coaching at local high schools, Oakland School for the Arts, Berkeley High School, and a couple of others. So, resources. We are really, really lucky to have a Foundation Center branch in San Francisco, and it's just down the street. You can jump on the 30 bus and it'll drop you off a block away. The Foundation Center is at 312 Sutter Street on the 6th floor. They have an amazing library that has databases that you can use for free there. You'd have to subscribe and pay a lot of money otherwise. Those databases are also often available at public libraries if you find yourself closer to a public library. The Foundation Center also offers ongoing workshops and trainings, some free, some not, a lot of webinars, more and more webinars these days. And the librarians are really knowledgeable and happy to help you. I think their hours are cut back now. I think it's Tuesday and Thursday from 10 to 5, unless you make an appointment, but I really encourage you to go check it out. They have an online presence called Grant Space, which you can find either through Foundation Center or on its own. Another great resource is Grant Makers in the Arts, which is a professional association of nonprofit foundations that make grants in the arts, obviously, and they have great resources. SFAI and other art schools' websites have resources, often lists of funders, calendars of deadlines, et cetera. California Arts Council and other state and federal agencies often have databases of grant opportunities, and if you get on their mailing lists, you'll get alerts every week or whatever. So that's a good thing to do, get on everybody's mailing list. As artists, there are several types of funding available to you. Project-based funding is, in a way, the simplest. If you have a project you want to do, and there's a funder that funds that kind of thing, you describe your project in your application, they fund it or not. Professional development is, in some ways, it's looser, and in some ways more helpful because you can use it for whatever you need. You don't have to justify a specific project. So if you, for instance, get a residency and need help traveling to the site of the residency, you can apply for a professional development grant for travel. Professional development grants are often pretty small, a few $100s, but they are very specific in that they're supporting artists in their ongoing practice. So, maybe you need supplies to start a new project. You can apply for a professional development grant. Residencies, if anybody attended the workshop last week, you would have heard a lot about residencies. And again, it's something that sometimes they'll pay for you to attend the residency, sometimes they'll simply offer you the space and you need to come up with the funding yourself. Another type of grant that's available to artists are collaborations with nonprofit organizations. And two local funders that provide funding for that, like really nice, generous grants up to about $500,000, are the Kenneth Rainin Foundation and the Creative Work Fund. SFAI recently got a Creative Work Fund grant in partnership with Will Brown and Lindsay White, who teaches here, to do a project, and those are structured as partnerships. You develop a memorandum of understanding, each entity applies, the artist and the organization, and that's kind of a trend in funding now for artists. And it's a great way for you to get the resources of an institution to help you with your work so that you're not doing a project and then hoping you can get an exhibition, for instance. This is a project that the Kenneth Rainin Foundation funded recently that ended up providing free meals for people in West Oakland. So it's a lot of community-based projects, a lot of placemaking, a lot of social justice projects. Question?
Do these types of foundations usually like give the money to institutions or like single artists or like groups? Like, is it kind of varied?
So it varies, but typically the structure is the institution gets some funding. They want a certain amount to go to the artists, and it's usually a really big chunk, like 2/3 or 3/4. The institution typically serves as the pass-through or the fiscal agent, but because the grant is awarded technically to the institution then sort of sub-grants to the artist.
So if we like applied this, it would mainly go to SFAI and then give a little bit to the artists that go here? Is that kind of what it is?
A lot to the artists.
Oh, okay.
So the budget, for instance, would show, say you have a $200,000 budget, it would show $50,000 for supplies, materials, installation, and $150,000 for artists and artist fees and artists' expenses. So these are actually great projects for artists in that I think the motivating force behind it is really to support artists, but give them a built-in platform for doing their work. One interesting thing about this kind of grant is that the funders often encourage artists to partner with unlikely organizations. So you might be partnering with a public utility or a senior center, that kind of thing, rather than a typical traditional museum.
So it's not like you have a project idea, it's more of like you as an artist partnering with a group and then creating a piece together.
Right, in the proposal, you will need to describe what you're planning to do. Although some funders like to provide seed money, so you need to describe what you might do or how you'll work together in the proposal, and then they'll want to see how that partnership develops into or solidifies into a project. Another thing that funders are doing more and more for artists, which is sad but great, is providing emergency grants and disaster funding. So recognizing that a lot of artists don't have, a steady job with a safety net, emergency grants are, as it says here, if you have sudden unanticipated opportunities, but you can't necessarily afford to take advantage of that without outside funding, or unbudgeted expenses that you might need to finish something that you've already started. Other funders are doing disaster funding. One funder has a call for artists who've been impacted by floods or hurricanes, and they name the specific natural disasters that have been happening around the country, or fires. You can apply for funding, and some of them have actually directed all their funding toward disaster funding for the next couple of years. People often ask about crowdfunding in the context of grant funding. And what some funders are doing now is partnering with individuals to match their crowdfunding efforts. So this organization, 3 Arts in Chicago, has something called 3 Arts Projects, where they give a third of the project total. So the artist has to raise 2/3, and then the funder kicks in the remaining thirds. This is actually, in case you want to support her, and I don't know her, so I have no stake in this, but this artist has a current crowdfunding project with 32 days left, and her project is, you'll see a slide where she describes it later in this presentation, but her project is called Race Dialogues, and she's created a couple of different card games to generate discussion around race and sort of it's a safe place to have uncomfortable conversations. And she has a long description of it here. So that is a great way to do crowdfunding because you can tell people up front that there's an organization that will match whatever they contribute. Any questions about types of funding? So before you begin, so that you're not wasting your time, it's really important to read the guidelines super carefully. Make sure that your project meets the eligibility, and typically the eligibility will have to do with geography, where you're located. Some funders will rotate geographic areas, so every other year they'll fund West Coast, every other year East Coast. Another good reason to be on mailing lists is so that you can keep track of that kind of thing, like, oh, they're funding my state this year or my city. Age and stage in your career is important. Often funders don't fund artists who are currently enrolled in school. So that's something for you all to be aware of. There are plenty that do, but a lot of them specifically don't. Previous grants from this funder, that's a really nice problem to have, but if you've gotten a grant, then they ask you to wait a few years before applying for another one. Also, make sure your grant is a fit for that your project is a fit for the grant. So if they want something that, creates, that activates your neighborhood, make sure that your project is actually going to do that. Don't try to fit the square peg in the round hole. A good thing to look at is who's received these types of grants in previous years so that you get a sense of what they're funding. Sometimes the guidelines don't tell the whole story. Note when the grant period begins and ends. If, say, your project starts before the grant period starts, often you can ask for funding for the costs that are incurred once the grant period starts, but that's a question to ask the funder. I've already started the research phase. Can I ask for funding for the implementation phase? And something, sort of a general message is, do not hesitate to ask the funder to call them multiple times and ask any questions you have. They actually want you to. Yes?
Sorry, there's like a timeline for the application, and then is there usually like a waiting period before the grant period begins? And like how much is usually that waiting period? Like once, let's just say you get accepted.
It depends. So often especially for government agencies, the review period is really, really long. Like the NEA, for instance, National Endowment for the Arts, if you apply in March, they tell you in November. And then your project can start January 1st. So really the window between when you know and when the project can start is only a month. It's really short. It's hard because sometimes you need to know in advance. You don't have to start January 1st, but it makes it tricky to plan. With smaller funders, typically they'll take, say, 2 or 3 months to review the proposal, and then you can start maybe 6 weeks after that. Again, it's kind of a game because, how much can you commit to before you know you have the funding. So there's always that disconnect.
Do you usually apply for like more than one grant for one project, or is it usually like one grant per project?
Yes. So we will talk about budgets, but anybody feel free to jump in. We don't have to go on the order of the slides. So funders like to see that you're looking for other funding. They don't necessarily have to see that you have the other funding, but they like to see that you're not simply relying on them. And one way to talk about it with them is to tell them that, for instance, their funding could help you leverage other funding and show in your budget that you've applied to or are planning to apply to other foundations. Another thing to show in your budget is, say you realize that you'll have to contribute $500 of your own money in order to make this happen. Make sure that you list yourself as a funder. Another thing to include is any in-kind support. So if you have a friend doing videography for you to document your project, figure out what the value of that is and include that as an in-kind support line. Start early. The last thing you want to do is start late and then be applying the day that the thing is due and see this spinning ball because there's something wrong with the online system. A lot of these funders, even though they have a lot of money to give away, they don't have a big operating budget. Same goes with the federal government. So sometimes they have kind of cut-rate databases, and there are often glitches on the last day because they're overloaded. Everybody's applying. Or maybe they were never completely working smoothly in the first place. So if you can, and I know procrastination is sort of human nature, try to set yourself a personal internal deadline of, say, 3 days before the thing is due to get everything in. So just quickly going through what you typically will be doing to submit an online application. Create an online account, and then that online account lets you start to explore the online application, which sometimes is a little bit different than the printed guidelines on the website. So you should see what they're requiring on the website, but then make sure that that's backed up by the different fields in the online application so that you're not surprised when you go in and cut and paste your work into the online application. Create your own checklist of items to prepare and submit. If you're going to need information from anyone, typically that would be letters of recommendation. Request it in advance. Be professional, be courteous, let someone know a month in advance, 3 weeks in advance that you're going to need a letter from them. Often funders will offer workshops either in person or online. Attend them if you can, especially if you're a first-time applicant. Ask questions. Contact the funder, as I said, with any questions. That's what they're there for. Contact the funder again with more questions, and submit before the drop-dead deadline. Okay, application components. For individual artist applications, these are the components that are almost always needed. And then if you're applying for a project grant, particularly if you're applying in partnership with an organization, it gets more complex, and we'll get into that shortly. But you'll need your artist statement, you'll need your artist bio, work samples, work sample descriptions, and usually a budget. So I know you've all had to write artist statements in various contexts, probably to get into this school. Your artist statement is something that will keep evolving, of course, as your career does and as your practice does, and also will change depending on the funding opportunity. So while you're not going to be sort of pretending you're someone else, you will be focusing on different aspects of your work or different projects, depending on what you're applying for. So one way to take advantage of the career development opportunities that are offered here at SFAI is to get help with your artist statement again and again if you feel you need it, because you'll be needing it for different contexts. Don't be afraid to go back and say, I need to rewrite my artist statement or refocus it. Typically, as you probably know better than I, artist statements should be first-person artist bios, which lists sort of your education, your credentials, are third person, but that's not always the case with funders. Sometimes they'll say, please submit a 200-word third-person artist statement. So that could be as simple as changing I to there, or making it third person. Or it could be a little different. Just make sure that you're reading the guidelines carefully. Work samples, most of you are probably super on top of developing really professional work samples. Make sure that you're using, again, look at the guidelines, see what the formats are that the funder accepts. They're pretty standard, but they vary from funder to funder. Sometimes they want consistency, sometimes they don't care. And then work sample descriptions, be really precise. So if you work in mixed media, for instance, don't simply say mixed media. List all the mixed medias that you're using. The more you can describe your work without someone seeing it, the better. That's sort of a criteria. And that goes back to the idea of grant writing for artists, which is not always a comfortable fit for people. Just the way if you're applying for a grant for your poetry anthology and someone said, draw a picture to explain why we should fund you, that would be difficult for most artists. Yes.
For the artist statement, is it more of like a project proposal or like project description, or is it like, because I feel like those are a little bit different than a statement, or like how do they want that written?
There are so many variations, and I'm actually going to skip ahead to a couple of examples because it's a really great question. We're just gonna skip. Okay, here we are. This is Kenyatta Forbes, the artist who's doing the crowdfunder, the screen that I showed earlier. So you can take a minute to read this. Well, I'll let you read it for a minute, then we can talk about it. So first of all, I'm kind of putting these artists out there, and my choice of artist statements that I'll be sharing with you is not at all a judgment on my part of whether these are good or bad, I actually love them all, but they're a point of, they're a good example of particular ways of doing an artist statement. So does anybody have any comment on this particular one in terms of, what's your name, I'm sorry? Julia's question about whether you're writing an artist statement to describe your project or something more general.
It seems like it's pretty general, but also uses a specific project as an example to back up the general description.
Exactly, which is a really useful way to do it. So you get a sense of who she is, what her work is about. You even get a sense of some of her experience, the kind of thing that might go into a bio, and then at the very end she hones in on this particular project that she's doing the fundraising for. Other examples? Hold on. I want to go backwards. Okay, this is actually, the same artist also has a business. She has a practice doing macrame that she started fairly recently, and she travels around and does macrame workshops. She was here in Oakland about a week ago. So here's a completely different description. You'd think it was a different person. Sometimes her artist statements weave together her two sort of practices. This one is, let's see, we'll start with this. This one is a little more general. Does anybody have any guess as to what this artist's work would be like? So you don't really get that from the artist statement. I think at the time she wrote this, she was creating duplicates of Levi's jeans that looked exactly like mass-produced Levi's jeans. She would take them into stores like Target, and it's called shop dropping, and she'd leave them in the store with a fabricated tag, and people wouldn't know the difference, and they'd actually try to buy the pair of jeans, but it wouldn't have been sort of coded with a barcode at the store. So once you know that, this makes sense, but she doesn't explain that. Here's another one by Zoe. Oh, there is a Zoe Saldana who's an actress, different person. Yes. Yeah. This Zoe Saldana is based in Brooklyn and teaches at Baruch College. This, again, you wouldn't know this at all. What she's referring to here is she does make everything by hand. So for instance, in her exhibitions, she will make the paint that goes on the walls. She'll paint the wall herself. She'll make the paper that the wall labels are on. So she has kind of an extreme maker practice where she's going back to a time when things were made by hand. And she has an upcoming exhibition next year, I think, where she's refused the assistance of the museum, and she's gonna do everything herself, making, again, the paint, the carpet, the nails, pounding them herself. So once you know that, this all makes sense. But these are really, beautiful, poetic artist statements that really work, I think. And she's been successful at getting exhibitions and grants. So it's what you're comfortable with and maybe what works in a particular context.
Quick question. Why do we see some artist statements written in first or third person?
In some cases, I think it's the artist's preference, and in some cases, it's what the funder or maybe the gallery wants. So again, the kind of rule of thumb is your artist statement is first person and your bio is third person, but some funders ask for it the other way. One thing when you're writing is, some people are more comfortable writing in the third person. So one exercise is, if you're trying to jumpstart your artist statement, is to write your artist statement in the third person and then go back and just change it into first person, as if you're writing about someone else. So part of the reason for showing these examples is to show that there are, successful, thriving artists who've done it multiple ways. So going back to just the application components, we'll go through this really quickly so we can get to a writing exercise. But so we just discussed this. Letters of recommendation, because this is sort of the most typical external thing, I'm kind of focusing on this because it has to do with kind of grantsmanship. Again, people tend to be really last minute. As a grant writer for an organization, I get contacted often by other organizations who need a sort of partner or endorsement letter, and they'll say, it's due tomorrow. So I guess two things. One, if somebody needs your help in that way, if you can help them, that's great, because someday you may need their help, and you may need them to drop everything and do it for you. But even better if you can do everything in advance and kind of by the book. It's professional, it'll make people want to help you again. So ask in advance, confirm that they can actually write you a strong letter of recommendation. If they sort of act funny, maybe it means that they're not really going to write you the strongest letter. Share a summary of the project you're applying for and or the guidelines for the application. Here's what I'm applying for, here's what you're writing a letter in support of. It's better to have a really strong letter by someone who's not particularly well known than, you know, a perfunctory letter by someone famous who you happen to meet or who's someone's neighbor. Follow up with a thank you. If you get the grant award, let them know. They'll be really happy that they helped. Budget, what to include, supplies and materials, any travel you might need, research. Equipment I put a star next to because you want to be careful, say you need to buy a new computer for the project. You don't want it to look as if you're using your grant funding just to get a new laptop. So if you're not sure whether to include that, you can always call the funder, explain the situation. I really do need this particular computer, bless you. And how should I show that? Or say you're contributing $1,000 of your own money. Maybe you could show that your $1,000 goes to the computer so that it doesn't, again, look like you're just trying to get a free computer. If you're hiring any people, they like to see that you're paying them, but don't show that you're paying yourself. And then again, major purchases that go beyond the project. If you're buying major equipment, you want to be careful so that they don't think you're just using the grant for that purpose.
If you don't show that you're paying yourself, but I mean, obviously if you're running a grant, you should be paying yourself. How do you navigate that?
So you're asking for, typically with a grant, you're asking for money for direct costs as opposed to an extra $20,000 so that, you know, you can spend a couple months working on your art without having to have another job. If you're applying for one of these collaborative projects like Creative Work Fund or the Rainin Foundation, then the funder actually wants to give cash to the artist. So they'll say, you know, 2/3 of this grant needs to go to the artist. And some of that will be just artists' living expenses. But with this kind of grant, if you're asking for project funding, you don't want, it's not like a job. If you're asking for professional development, then you know, you can say, I need the time to work, and in that context, it might work out. But if it's just a project grant, you can't be paying yourself a salary. Budget income, you'll want to show the funder you're applying to. Don't forget to put them on the list. Other funders, as Julia brought up, and your own personal contribution. Then the budget supports the narrative. So if, for instance, you say that you're going to be documenting your project with videos and then put them online, make sure that that's an item in your budget, and vice versa. If there are things in your budget, make sure that they're backed up in your narrative.
Does it cost money to put a project online? Like, why would that be part of the...
Say you have a friend or somebody else doing it and they need to actually be the videographer, then they need to edit it. If you're an organization, this probably won't come up for you, but if you're an organization, sometimes we'll ask for funding for maintaining a website, for instance, as just kind of an ongoing expense. But as an individual artist, that probably won't come up. Okay. If your application is declined, which happens more than not, so the first thing is, does the funder provide feedback? And if so, get in touch. Sometimes they say they don't provide feedback because too many people are contacting them. What you can do is, 3 months later, get in touch and say, do you have time to provide feedback now? They keep files on everybody. In a way, they have to sort of justify their decisions. So they can, if they have time, they can go back, look at your file, and say, oh yeah, here's what the reviewers said. Definitely make use of all the work that you did on the application. So reuse or adapt elements of the application for other funders, and apply again next time. Optional items, sometimes a grant application will say, if there's anything else that we should know that would help us make a decision, or if you'd like to include other items such as press, describing your previous work, et cetera, or letters of recommendation, always take advantage of that, because it's just another way to provide supporting materials and explain yourself. Here are a couple of excerpts from guidelines. This is the Harpo Foundation, which is an amazing foundation in a way in that they give you money. It doesn't have to be tied to a particular project. And you can see they're asking for a 200-word artist's statement, either about your work or about a project. So this goes back to the discussion we had. It can be either, or it can be both. There are several artists' foundations. This is obviously Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner. Many of the artist foundations really exist to maintain the artist's legacy, but often the artist's wishes were that they support the next generation of artists. So some of them also do give grants. In this case, the artist's statement is actually descriptions of the images that you've included. So they're just defining artist's statement in a way that we typically don't. So again, just be really careful when you read the guidelines to understand what they're looking for, even if you don't understand quite why. Never assume your work speaks for itself or that your reputation precedes you. So you can be the most successful artist in the world, but somehow you need money. And if you submit a sloppy or incomplete application, you won't get funded, or you shouldn't get funded, because there will be people who adhere to the guidelines and submit really carefully produced, thorough applications. Especially with government agencies, they have to be really careful about the decisions they make. So the San Francisco Arts Commission, for instance, has funders or applicants sit in on the panels. So you're invited as an organization or an individual artist to sit there in the audience while the panel discusses your work. And I did that for the first time this year. It's a really interesting experience. You feel really exposed because you hear people talking about you. They're usually pretty careful not to say anything too negative, but you hear what's going into their decisions. Things that I heard were, for instance, they're doing outreach to the community, but they don't say how. So is it going to be through in-person appearances at community neighborhood organizations? Is it going to be advertising? Is it going to be banners? Is it going to be flyers at targeted locations? That kind of thing. So they are really drilling down. Thoroughness is one thing that they're looking for. In terms of sort of as an artist, what is going to get them to pay attention to your work? The one kind of consistent thing is consistent practice. So they don't have to love your work, but if you're committed, if you've been working consistently, if you have a journal, if you have a consistent portfolio, that's the kind of thing that they're looking for. So they're not really making, or they're trying not to make aesthetic judgments. Your work may be beautiful or not, it may be pleasing to a particular person, but if you're a serious artist, that's what they're looking for.
I just want to let you know we just have a few minutes remaining.
Okay, I am going to give you your writing assignment to take with you. Okay, in terms of writing, omit needless words. Yeah, thank you. And paper and pen. Okay, so this was going to be a 10-minute writing assignment, and it's really just to get you to actually do something. So what the assignment is, and please just start it here and then take it with you, is think about what you would ask for funding for if there was a funder that would support anything, very general. It could be a project, it could be a residency, it could be travel to do research halfway around the world, and just start writing. Don't worry about any of these things. Don't omit the needless words yet. Don't worry about being poetic. You can be vague, you can be flaky, you can be academic, pompous, and obscure. And then the exercise is, once you've written for 10 or 15 minutes, go back and shrink it to, say, 150 words that says the same thing, and think about these kind of writing mandates. Do you guys have any more questions or any observations? I mean, you probably all have experience putting your work out there, and you may have observations to share that could help the group, or anything that you might have experience that contradicts things that I've said. So, yes.
I noticed when I was looking for grants and stuff, like what you said, that a lot of them don't offer anything to students.
Right.
Is there any exception to that you know of that you can suggest we look into, or is it kind of just like figure it out by the time you graduate?
I am going to look that up, because off the top of my head, I can't remember like which ones support students and which ones don't. So, you can just write your info here.
Thank you.
Can I write mine too?
Sure, yeah. And I will, I do emails, so if you want to contact me at SFAI, it's E. Isacson. It's EISAACSON at sfai.edu.
much for being here to present on grant writing with us today.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your attention.